except me, that will work. Okay, well, obviously it's a very great pleasure to be with you. And I was looking forward to going out to Calgary. It was supposed to be last, as you said, April 2020. I have some friends there. I haven't been back for a while, so I was looking forward to it. So I hope we can live in hope that, you know, an in-person visit in future again will happen. But it is a great pleasure to be with you, if only virtually. And as you know, I'm talking about rethinking, you know, the need to rethink security. So what I want to do is sort of go through how the Rideau Institute has been thinking about this for quite a long time. Our, you know, the interest goes way back, but a concerted focus began when we were preparing a submission to the 2016 Defense Policy Review, where we collaborated with other organizations and submitted a paper calling for new thinking on foreign and defense policy. And in that paper, which was updated in Project Ploughshares and Canadian Pugwash Group and others all were part of that. In that paper, which was updated in 2018, we said in part, we urge Canada to embrace the UN framework of sustainable peace and work for cooperative solutions to violent conflict, and help proactively guide others towards this shift to a sustainable common security outlook. Common security puts a premium on the machinery and diplomacy of international cooperation. There is less reliance on the competitive pursuit of national security at the expense of others. It is therefore a more perfect reflection of the UN Charter provisions against the use of force and in favor of the peaceful resolution of disputes and of the equal right to security of all states.
It's wonderful to see everybody there. I was supposed to introduce Peggy, but I gather she's been introduced and she's functioning very well. So we're honored to have you here. I apologize for my Zoom delays, and I'm listening with great interest to your talk. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Just continuing on with our paper on a shift to sustainable peace and common security, we said also there, because prevention of armed conflict should be our first priority in reaching global sustainable peace, we called for Canada to increase its overseas development assistance towards the target of 0.7% of our GDP, and also to ensure that our policies on trade, investment, and migration contribute to the sustainable development goals articulated in the UN's Agenda 2030. And other measures that we called for included the establishment of an arm's length nonpartisan National Institute for Sustainable Common Security with long-term financial viability. It's really worth pointing out, Canada is one of the few leading OECD countries without such an institution, and frankly, it really shows. We called for full re-engagement in UN peacekeeping as a foreign and national defense priority, foreign affairs and national defense priority. We called for the reestablishment of a civilian-led multidisciplinary peacekeeping training center in Canada, and support for a United Nations standing emergency peace service to provide timely response to prevent atrocities. We also called for a complete reorientation of the failed war on terror on the basis that terrorism is not defeated primarily with military measures, but by a comprehensive approach which focuses on rule of law and good governance in order to effectively address root causes and underlying grievances rooted in political, economic, and social exclusion. And we called for vigorous support for international control of weapons, including banning those that cause indiscriminate or disproportionate harm to civilians, rejecting destabilizing weapons systems like the American Strategic Ballistic Missile Defense boondoggle, which to date Canada has managed to stay out of, We called for Canada to declare a moratorium on the development and deployment of lethal, fully autonomous weapon systems, popularly known as killer robots, and for Canada to leverage its considerable expertise in artificial intelligence, robotics, engineering, and international law in order to lead an international initiative to bring about a ban on killer robots and to work for the establishment of an international control regime for armed drones. And we also called for Canada to work with NATO to reduce and eliminate its reliance on nuclear weapons. And this was before the ban treaty had been negotiated that we instituted that call. And we also, of course, called for Canada to ensure that our arms exports are fully in accordance with the arms trade treaty. At the time that we initially made that call, Canada hadn't joined the treaty yet, but we had pledged to do it. Now, the concluding section of that document began, Canada with no direct threats to its territory and a web of bilateral, regional, and multilateral cooperative security arrangements to draw upon is in a unique position to help build the United Nations envisaged by the Charter. That visionary document highlights the interdependence of human rights, human development, and international peace and security. It places conflict prevention and the peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with international law at the heart of its architecture. It limits the national use of force to self-defense, and even then, only so long as UN-led collective action has not been brought to bear. Canada can give high priority to using our military assets, human and material, to strengthen the UN's capacity for rapid response in times of crisis, to shore up fragile peace processes, and to help implement comprehensive peace agreements. These actions by Canada aimed at strengthening international peace and security will in turn enhance Canadian sovereignty and security in the interconnected world we all share. So that was our first concerted effort to build begin a broader Canadian dialogue on rethinking security, to move away from a national military-centric concept to a global human security-centric concept. And while the government did respond in certain areas, rhetorically perhaps much more than substantively, especially in terms of re-engagement in UN peacekeeping and championing multilateralism and international law, clearly there was no significant reorientation towards more cooperative approaches to international security writ large. Then came the pandemic and the dawning realization on many, not just foreign policy experts, that all those billions spent on military security were utterly useless to counter the coronavirus pandemic or the two massive existential threats we face, climate change and ecological collapse. Never mind the pernicious role that the competitive military security model plays in exacerbating the third existential threat hanging over us, nuclear war. This led to a global outpouring of questioning of our pre-pandemic priorities, which the Rideau Institute began to track and comment on in our weekly ceasefire.ca and Rideau Institute blogs. In our 30 March blog, at the onset of the lockdown during the first COVID-19 wave, we highlighted part of a Talk to Al Jazeera interview with Dr. Michael Ryan, the head of the WHO Health Emergencies Program, where he stated, "When this is done, we need to sit down and see what kind of society we want to have in future. Are we to be defended from foreign armies, or are we to be defended from viruses? Where are we putting our investment in society, our civilization, our way of life?" To build on that comment, I would refer to the Secretary General in his centerpiece address to the historic 75th session of the General Assembly. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated, quote, "Today we face our own 1945 moment. And like the post-war generation that sought to build a new world order, we too must summon the collective will to address the world of challenges to come." The Secretary General added that the COVID-19 crisis is, quote, a wake-up call and a dress rehearsal for those challenges. Back to our 30 March blog, which also looked at the world's grossly misplaced spending priorities, with American Daryl G. Kimball, head of the prestigious UN Arms Control Association, writing, "If we are to survive well into this century, there must be a profound shift in the way we deal with global security challenges and how we align our scientific, economic, diplomatic, and political resources to address the health, climate, and nuclear dangers that threaten us all." In other words, we have to realign all of those resources to address the real threats. And we also quoted renowned peace and security expert Paul Rogers, where he said, what is actually required is a human rights dimension to security, the need to see it as a common right to freedom from fear and want, rooted in socioeconomic and ecological awareness. In our April 6th blog, we wrote, "But just as climate change is driving calls for a radical reorientation of the global economy towards sustainable, eco-friendly options, so too is the coronavirus pandemic encouraging a second look at how to retool military enterprises." That one is, that's a hard sell, but boy, is it necessary. To that end, we quoted from a letter to UK parliamentarians from 3 former United Kingdom Royal Navy commanders who were decrying the misallocation of scarce resources in the time of pandemic. And they stated, "It is completely unacceptable that the UK continues to spend billions of pounds on deploying and modernizing the Trident nuclear weapon system when faced with threats to health, climate change, and world economies that coronavirus poses." And this brings us to Canada's defense budget, where the government announced on 7 June 2017, a whopping 70% increase over 10 years. Here's the really important part, with most of the new funds being delivered after 2021. Yet, for at least the last 10 years, the Department of National Defense has been unable to spend the annual monies allocated. At least $2 billion per year has thus accumulated since the 2017 budget increases were announced. $2 billion a year they haven't been able to spend. Therefore, I said in the blog where we discussed this, it does not take a genius to figure out that these unused funds are ripe for redeployment to address urgent human security needs. We have the money. It's the priorities that we set that need to be changed. In our June 8th blog, we looked at the need to narrow our definition of national security and to clearly distinguish it and the even narrower concept of military security from global security. Using this lens, nations need to focus much less on destroying enemies abroad, building up the capacity to do that, spending billions to do that, and much more on building human security and resilience at home. A key part of the Rideau Institute and broader global examination of what should constitute global security going forward concerns the global imperative to achieve constructive engagement with China, however difficult that might be. So I'm turning now from some of the conceptual stuff and some of the framework stuff to, the actual relations with other countries. During the Trump administration, there was little Canada could do except to keep its head down, having made the initial fatal error of arresting Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou, and then compounding it by failing to exercise the clear ministerial discretion to stay the extradition proceedings when Trump made it clear we were a pawn in his trade game with China. The role of China looms in the big question, what kind of future do we want? Jeffrey Sachs situates the steady American right-wing cacophony demanding tougher actions against China, led in Canada by the then Scheer conservatives, was led by Scheer when we were writing this, as part of a fundamental battle of ideas. In his spring 2020 article entitled, "Will America Create a Cold War with China?" he wrote, American policy towards China is now up for grabs, with hardliners and softliners battling for the upper hand. The hardliners view China as an existential threat to American security and interests. The softliners regard China as a powerful counterpart, on occasion friend, competitor, or adversary, but not an existential threat. In my view, this is Sachs talking, the hardline approach to be pursued through protectionist trade policies and aggressive technology policies would prove disastrous, weakening the world economy and creating a self-fulfilling grave risk of future conflict. In an April 2020 article entitled The American Muddle, two distinguished China experts put it thusly: the US cannot recapture the hegemonic global leadership of the past, and it shouldn't try. The world is shifting towards a multipolar world in which, as Harvard's Joseph Nye has explained, power is diffused among multiple nation states, multinational corporations, non-state actors, and diverse communities in terms of race, gender, religion, and culture. At the same time as this diffusion of power is taking place, challenges are becoming increasingly global in nature, with a pandemic being a case in point. For the US, the rational response would be to lead a cooperative effort to address shared challenges, including the looming recession, technological disruption, and climate change. For this to work, all stakeholders, including US rivals like China, Russia, and Iran, must be involved. And I think, and this was our comment, it is manifestly clear which vision of the future Canada should be doing everything in its power to support and nurture. So to this end, the Rideau Institute recommended that Canada open discreet talks with the Biden campaign. We were doing this, of course, before the election, through political intermediaries to lay the groundwork for a Canadian stay of extradition proceedings against Meng should Biden become president. By this, we did not mean to suggest that there would be an end to the US legal proceedings against Meng, whether or not the anti-Iran sanctions on which the case against her is based are eased by the new administration. But what it will mean is that the likelihood of unseemly retaliation, excuse me, for a Canadian stay of extradition proceedings will be immeasurably reduced. In other words, the Biden administration will be unlikely to do the kinds of retaliation that Trump would certainly do. Of course, our Justice Minister, David Lametti, and I'm a lawyer, so for me, this was really hard to understand, has inexplicably made this task much harder as long as he's around by his astonishingly short-sighted declaration on Friday, 26 July, that he would not intervene in extradition proceedings for Meng before the court process reached its end, which could take years. He's got the unfettered discretion to intervene whenever he wants. Why didn't he just keep quiet and wait and see if Biden was elected? But no, he made this extraordinary binding of his hands. I will do nothing until the entire court proceeding is over. Well, let's hope that he doesn't stick to that. What about Huawei? Whatever the legitimate security concerns about which no actual evidence has yet been made public by the United States, banning Huawei Canada from all Five Eyes 5G networks. Five Eyes, the intelligence, the five country intelligence network to which Canada belongs and which greatly influences the view of our intelligence agencies about whether or not Huawei is in fact a risk. And we would argue it's mainly about handicapping an American strategic competitor and reinforcing the dependence of the Anglosphere Western allies on US intelligence priorities and forcing those same allies into a US-led economic bloc against China. And as we have written before, this is I'm referring to our blogs, this is actually in no country's interest, but right-wing ideologues in the United States see it as a way to maintain US dominance over traditional allies and to keep the military-industrial complex alive and well, and fully fed. I might note that somebody's not muted because I can hear coughing. So I just ask everybody to mute. Thank you. For an interesting comment on China's role in making a bad situation worse, lest folks think that I'm somehow, overlooking China's transgressions. This is an interesting commentary by a Chinese expert. Chinese leaders have only themselves to blame for their growing international isolation. With an inflated sense of their power, they have overplayed a weak hand and driven friendly or neutral countries such as the UK, Canada, India, and Australia into the arms of the United States. I'll finish in this section by talking about by referencing Wesley Wark. He is one of Canada's foremost non-governmental intelligence experts. I mean, he's done inside work. He's an academic, a professor, but he's also had stints working inside government on these issues. He has stated, he's written, including in the Globe and Mail, that there is no security consensus in Canada that Huawei represents any kind of security threat as a spy proxy for the Chinese government. I mean, you'd be hard pressed, unless you specifically read Wesley Wark, to believe that, because most of the media commentary sort of states it as a fait accompli, that it's a security threat. And he also notes that the Americans have failed to provide any meaningful evidence. He also says the recent British decision to abandon its use of Huawei in its network was a technical decision prompted by the market realities of a US export ban. In other words, it was not because they believed there was a spy threat. And to sort of emphasize why this matters, because people say, well, who cares? We don't like China. Why do we don't want Huawei involved? Wesley Wark points out the devastating economic impact if we lose Huawei Canada. And of course, it's important to point out that Huawei Canada is subject to Canadian law. It's a Canadian subsidiary of the Chinese Huawei. So Wesley Wark writes, we will lose the benefits of the outlay we've put into, of its outlay, estimated in Ontario alone at $500 million, and support for some 3,800 jobs. Canadian research and development in 5G, where Huawei Canada was a global leader, will suffer. The United States lags in 5G. This is one area where Canada was well ahead. Canadian universities that have forged research partnerships with Huawei will struggle with other sources of funding hard to come by. Rural and northern Canada may suffer further delays on access to modern technologies, infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, if Huawei has to pull out of Canada. And we've all seen the problems that rural areas and northern Canada are having now that in the pandemic, internet access is so important, and we find that the access in Canada is so unequal. Wark also points out the other obvious consequence of Canada, if we make the decision to ban Huawei Canada in 5G, will be a further deterioration in Canada-China relations. So let us fervently hope that Canada can chart a new course with the Biden administration, which in turn means that the US itself charts a less confrontational course with China, cooperating on global challenges, including climate change, public health, and global trade. Now, we don't know what direction Biden's going to go in yet. I mean, there's tremendous hardline position in the US against China. He's been careful in his language so far. He certainly hasn't closed the door to cooperation on global challenges, especially on climate change. But of course, he has made strong statements on with respect, for example, to the treatment of the Uyghurs, Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. Now, returning again to the theme of rethinking security, we want to look further at intelligence agencies and their role in national security. And you think of the money that's spent on those intelligence agencies. Canada, I don't even actually know the number Canada has, but a number of intelligence agencies. And there's actually been no recent definitive study of how much money we spend on them. That would be a good research project. We explored in our 20 July blog the troubling history of illegal actions by our intelligence agencies in the war on terror. And then we stated But of course, we want more from our intelligence agencies than acting within the law and refraining from undermining the fundamental rights, human rights of the Canadian citizenry they are supposed to protect. We want some evidence of value for money. So that leads to the question, what exactly did our extensive, expensive array of intelligence agencies know about the impending pandemic, if anything? And what did they do with whatever knowledge they had? Well, bear in mind that the intelligence agencies keep telling the government that Canadian participation in the Five Eyes intelligence network led by the US is fundamental. We must be part of that because of the information we get. We know that President Trump was briefed at the earliest possible moment by those intelligence agencies on the pandemic, early January. So we have to assume that that means that because of our partnership in Five Eyes and our access to that intelligence, that our intelligence agencies also knew that. But the bottom line is whatever warnings came from our multi-billion-dollar intelligence apparatus and our access to the Five Eyes, it seems to have had little effect at all in prompting early government action. I mean, there's evidence that the government of Canada was briefed by the intelligence agencies quite early. But the point is, it doesn't appear that the briefings were such that they really, emphasized that this was an important matter. Because what we do know is that Canada, for reasons that go unexplained, missed the opportunity to do proper risk assessments, to seize the opportunity of early warning, to do the planning and to get the response planning really into gear. So as a result of all of that, the Rideau Institute issued the following call. In the aftermath of the pandemic, when lessons are hopefully being learned, we call on the Government of Canada to review our national security priorities and threat assessments to better align them with growing human security challenges. Now, we also in our blogs since March outlined a series of other steps that Canada should take. I mean, global affairs, and we've written a lot about the terrible, lamentable state of disarray that global affairs is in. It lost so many resources and people during the dark Harper years, and there's a real need for rebuilding, which this government, which the Liberals have not engaged in. And so their capacity to undertake a meaningful foreign policy review is limited without rebuilding diplomatic capacity. I mean, most of the place is run by people who aren't diplomats, who have no diplomatic experience. So what we've called for is a national commission on sustainable common security to build back, to feed into UN efforts to build back better after the pandemic. We've also called for mechanisms to ensure that we finally start to meet our international human rights and other legal obligations, including an independent, impartial agency to administer Canada's arms export controls, given the shockingly inadequate performance of global affairs to date, manifestly unable to restrict arms exports in accordance with our international obligations, the exports to Saudi Arabia being a case in point, as well as to Turkey. We also call for new thinking on national compliance measures to end our blatant violation of Security Council mandated obligations with respect to Palestinian human rights. I mean, we're not following UN mandated rules on labeling to clearly separate so that goods from the occupied territories are not labeled as coming from Israel, just to give one example. I mean, a court case ruled on that, and Canada's still trying to get around it. So clearly we need better national mechanisms for enforcement. Action to shore up our lagging commitment to Palestinian human rights is all the more urgent in light of the Government of Canada's shocking response to the recent, it was just last week, the historic ruling of the International Criminal Court that it has jurisdiction over war crimes or atrocities committed in the Palestinian territories, opening the door for possible investigations. I mean, this is a huge step forward. Despite the International Criminal Court's prosecutors stating that there is a reasonable belief that war crimes have been or are being committed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, by both Israel and Hamas with respect to the rockets launched into Israel, Canada continued to defend its position that Palestine should not have any standing before the ICC, the International Criminal Court, until negotiations with Israel lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state. In other words, Canada, a country that was instrumental in the establishment of the International Criminal Court, is now arguing that Palestinians should have no redress for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Israel against them until Israel agrees to end its occupation, negotiates an end to its occupation. I mean, how can one even believe that that's Canada's position? But, our blog linked to the government statement, there it is in black and white. Now I'll just move quickly. I want to say a few words about Canada's feminist foreign policy. That was supposed to be the topic that that I was supposed to speak on when I was supposed to come in person in April 2020. And we wrote in our blogs, and we did this in concert with Canadian Pugwash Group, and then others as well submitted documents. Canada is Global Affairs Canada is in the midst of civil society consultations on its feminist foreign policy with a view to issuing a white paper in early 2021. And then, as I said, Rideau Institute and the Canadian Pugwash Group was the lead on this. We submitted a brief. And I just want to touch on the conceptual understanding, because it gets back to these broader notions of a shift to sustainable peace and common security. We began, or the paper began, with a statement on conceptual understanding. It is important that a feminist foreign policy is situated in a broader context of an approach to peace and security defined by the concepts of sustainability and commonality. This in turn is rooted in active commitments to a rule-based international system, the peaceful settlement of disputes, global cooperation, respect for human rights, and a security concept that places the security of humans at its core. A feminist foreign policy should progress beyond the focus on increasing the participation of women in conflict resolution and peace operations, get beyond the head count to devise policies that promote sustainable peace and common security. And then we went on to urge Global Affairs, the Rideau Institute then went on to urge Global Affairs to use the white paper resulting from this initial consultation as a stepping stone to a far broader examination of how a feminist foreign policy can play a central role in redefining global and national security priorities to meet pressing human security needs. I mean, that's what a real feminist foreign policy should do. Now, I just want to end on this notion of global cooperation in the time of pandemic. I mean, my goodness, look what happens when there is global cooperation. If you had asked anybody in April of 2020 if we would have had this rollout of all of these vaccines in this time period, made possible by the vast sharing of scientific information across the globe, this has led to just the fastest imaginable rollout of vaccines. And we've also seen global cooperation with the WHO to create COVAX, a global mechanism to try and ensure equitable access to vaccines and treatments. Canada has contributed, I don't know how many people know this, we have contributed $865 million to COVAX, almost $1 billion to that mechanism. It was a mechanism that's meant to provide equitable access to all, so rich and poor. So this is one area where I'm not going to beat up on the government. We may be the only G7 country to draw from COVAX, but we are not the only wealthy country. New Zealand, for example, which is cited, as in good governance terms everywhere, has also drawn on COVAX to get their share of vaccines. And of course, the reason why is because neither New Zealand nor Canada have our own production capacity, which many wealthy nations do. I mean, hopefully we're going to get ours soon, but we haven't got it to date. So that's the really good news. But on the other hand, we have also seen many examples of vaccine nationalism. And we know that despite the COVAX mechanism, despite all the money that's been put into it, the rollout to developing countries of vaccines still lags far behind that of the wealthy, although, you know, progress is being made, but not nearly enough. And at this point, I want to reference a warning that the then head of the International Crisis Group, Robert Malley, who now is the Biden administration's Iran envoy, hurrah, he's the best possible person to be the Iran envoy. He said that while you would think that the pandemic would propel deeper international cooperation to confront shared challenges, and of course it has insofar as the vaccine is concerned, he was afraid that the socioeconomic despair that the pandemic has caused might also contribute to even stronger xenophobic surges, with the scapegoating of foreigners and minorities. And, you know, south of the border, look what we saw, you know, in the waning days of the Trump administration. But we did not include that warning in our blog as a counsel of despair, but a clarion call to action. All around the world, folks are getting brief, searing glimpses of the just, peaceful, and sustainable world we can create in the wake of the coronavirus devastation. Let that be our guide. And I'll stop there, and I really look forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Peggy. That was awesome. If anyone has a question,